Most scales nowadays are digital. They use electricity to determine how much something weighs. What I'm interested in is these old-style mechanical scales, sometimes called spring scales. No batteries required here. In this video, we'll take apart two of these scales to see how they work on the inside. The idea of using springs in a scale has been around for about 200 years now. This one is called a floor scale, and this one is called a hanging scale. So let's spring right into the details here, and we'll start with the hanging scale. These are commonly used at the grocery store. The more weight, or the harder that you pull on the bottom, the more that the red pointer spins on the inside. Take away the weight, and the red pointer goes back to 0. Let's take it apart and see what's on the inside. The first thing you'll notice are two large springs on the inside. They are hooked onto the top piece, which is bolted to the frame of the scale. In the center, we have the gear system. This piece is called the rack. Hidden inside of here is called the pinion gear. As the rack goes back and forth, the pinion gear spins too. The rack is bolted to the frame that the springs are on. So when the springs go down, the rack goes down too, which then spins the gear. There's another tiny spring here which pulls on the rack. This ensures that we have good contact with the pinion gear. The center of the gear goes out and pokes through the center of the dial so that we can attach the red pointer. Now as the scale is pulled down, the springs stretch, which moves the rack, turns the gear, turns the red pointer, which then shows how much the object weighs. The reason that a scale like this works is because of something called Hooke's law. It's the relationship between how much force you pull on a spring versus how far that spring stretches. So just for an example, let's put a 1 kilogram object on this spring. It stretches 1 centimeter. Okay, now let's double the weight. Now it stretches 2 centimeters. For each extra kilogram, the spring stretches another centimeter. If you put it on a graph, then it's a straight line, or in other words, it's a linear relationship. This means it's predictable. Now let's take a look at the floor scale. Two tiny springs hold it all together. It's easiest to unhook it from the bottom. The front cover comes off and the insides become visible. The big difference here is that instead of a red pointer moving across the dial, this time the whole dial actually moves while the red pointer is stationary. The dial is attached to another pinion gear with a rack moving across it. This of course is very similar to the hanging scale that we saw earlier. The end of the rack is attached to a small spring which pulls it towards the edge. Things get interesting at the other end of the rack. We've got a lever that can pivot back and forth. It's attached to the rack, and remember, the rack is constantly being pulled this way. The only thing stopping it is another metal plate right beneath it. This plate is held up by our main spring. There's only one of them this time, and it's quite a bit smaller. Our spring is still hanging, but the end of it is attached to a metal plate. When the plate goes down, the spring is stretched. This also means the lever is allowed to rotate. The metal plate is pressed down by 4 metal bars that go across the scale, 2 long ones and 2 shorter ones that hang right beneath it. All 4 of the bars also rest on the edges of the scale case. The lid to the scale has 4 supports on the bottom. Each of these supports rests on one of the 4 bars in the scale. When you stand on the scale, your weight is distributed down through the 4 bars over to the metal plate, which moves down and stretches the spring, allows the lever to rotate, which moves the rack, which then rotates the gear that moves the dial. No matter where you stand on the scale, your weight gets distributed to the tiny spring, which uses Hooke's law to determine your weight.